You're listening to the Parents of Hardworking Teens podcast, episode 19. And before your teen dives into doing any additional study, anything beyond what they've been set in class or for homework, make sure you listen to this episode because I see so many students studying for the sake of studying. And that's exactly what some of you have asked about in your questions. And so that's what I'm going to do today. Answer your questions about what extra study your teen could or should be doing and what not to do. Let's go. I'm Katie Jones, and with over 15 years in education as an award-winning high school teacher, international external examiner, and as a study coach, I've helped thousands of students skyrocket their results and confidence. And this podcast is where I share all my insights, tactics, and tips with you, the parent, so you can help your hardworking teen get happy, smart, and successful in their study, and have you both enjoy the journey along the way. This is the Parents of Hardworking Teens podcast. Hey VIPs, how is your day going? Mine is about to get really, really good because I'm diving into our second of 3 monthly listener Q&A episodes. So if you've sent in a question, thank you so much. And if you haven't and still want to, then email it through to support@rocksolidstudy.com because we have one more episode coming up on the first Tuesday of November. And I'm selecting the questions that I think will be most helpful to share and respond to here on the podcast. And if I don't answer your question on the podcast, then I will be replying to you personally with a response on email. So please feel free to dive in and ask me anything you want. Now, I'm going to be answering 2 questions today on this episode. And the first is from AH. They just gave their initials, AH, and they wrote, "My son does very little study at home. He doesn't seem to be set much homework. What could he be doing that will help him improve his grades?" He's mostly sitting on C's, but I have no doubt he could be doing better. "And his confidence, especially in exams." So definitely listen up. If your teen doesn't get set much additional homework, or, they say they get it done in class or at school, and they don't have much extra study, and you want to know what else they could be doing to maximize their results and develop maybe their exam technique or build their subject knowledge. Or even if they do get set homework, but they like to go over and above, and you want some ways to make sure that they do really maximize their performance by taking on some independent study of their own, but you also want to make sure that they're not slaving away on things that aren't necessarily going to give them that much benefit. And to that point, the first thing we have to keep in mind here is that hours studying do not equal results. By that, I mean that more hours does not directly equal more marks in homework, in exams, in assignments. Now, that is going to be good news for some and bad news for others. But it means that we have to make sure that any extra time and effort that your teen puts in is strategic and that it has a clear outcome, a specific way it is going to benefit your teen and their results. So it's probably easier for me to start off with what I recommend students don't do, but that I do see a lot of students doing or a lot of parents thinking their teen should be doing. So first of all, don't let them just write up or copy out notes. Don't have them rereading a novel or rewatching the movie that they're studying multiple times. I'm going to go into more detail on this in a moment. And don't have them doing extra reading or wider research. There is never any need to go beyond the syllabus if we are just focused on marks and criteria for assessments or exams. Now, in saying each of those, there's nothing wrong with doing those things if it is for pleasure. Like if they just love the novel and they want to reread it, go for it. Or if it's because you want them to do extra reading for other reasons, like building their awareness of world events just so that they can have more knowledge and can hold conversations socially about those things, in which case, for sure, go ahead. Or let's say they have a passion for a subject or an interest and just love finding out and researching more and more about it, then of course, go for it. But just don't have them do those things thinking that they're going to lead to higher grades when it comes to exams, essays, assignments, coursework. Here's why. Just copying up notes is a very passive and time-consuming activity. It doesn't take any thinking, which is what makes it passive. And writing things out in full also, of course, takes a pretty long time. Now, if they want to review that information, perhaps they want to really check their understanding, lock it further into their long-term memory, that is, of course, no bad thing. But copying up notes is a bad way to do it. So it's no bad thing, but copying up notes is a bad way to do it. It's just not effective. So what they could do instead is just condense the notes. So they're putting it into their own words and shortening it down, picking out the key information, but even better, convert the notes into a different format. So for example, they could turn a series of events from history into maybe a simple storyboard. And I'm not talking about a work of art here. I am talking about stick figures. Or they could challenge themselves to condense the 2 pages of class notes, let's say, into just 5 bullet points, key points. Or they could take the novel that they're reading and produce a character web, something very spatial and visual from something that is full of text. Now, the biggest objection I get from students for this is that they're going to be losing information by condensing things down or not putting in every little stat or fact. But the fact is they already have the information. So if they're copying up notes from something they did in class or even from a textbook or a handout, they already have that information, so they don't need to worry about losing information by doing this. What this will do is force them to process that information, which means that not only will it really be testing their true understanding, but it will also mean that more of it is going to be stored in their long-term memory. And I don't mean that they need to remember it forever. I just mean longer than an hour. So just reading or writing or repeating information as is doesn't do that. We have to actively process or transform the information. And the last thing that either of us want, me or you, is having students, having your teen doing extra study that just isn't going to pay off for them. Because that just means they end up getting burnt out, stressed, maybe they end up really diminishing or denting at least their confidence or their self-belief or their motivation. Because if they're putting in more time and more effort but not seeing any results from it, that's when things start to take that downwards spiral. So let's also take that example of rereading the novel. Again, don't just reread it. Do something with it. So ask them or have them ask themselves, what is the purpose of rereading it? And that's what I want you to ask as a question behind all of these things. What is the purpose? If it's to understand the actual storyline and events better, then maybe have them write out a storyboard as they go. If they start to get confused and they're not really sure what's happening, then that will certainly highlight that because they're going to get stuck on what's the next block on my storyboard. And then, of course, that means that they need to go and take action to deal with that. They can't just gloss over it. They maybe need to go ask their teacher a question, maybe look it up on an online study guide or get some peer support to help them get clear. And if they totally already know what's going on, then they need to question whether they really need to reread the story at all. But again, it's not the rereading of the novel that is a bad thing to do. I do know that lots of students get told to reread a text more than once, but they need to know why they're being advised to do that or why they should. It's because they need to do something different each time. For example, the first time they read it through is probably just to get an understanding of what is going on, what the storyline is, what happens. But then they can start to focus on things like the main characters or the key themes or message of the text and where that is coming through. And again, if they need some clarification on that, then they're going to need to take action to get those things nailed down. So I'll share a real example with you. Here's a way that I got a student to do this recently. They had to watch the whole series of A Handmaid's Tale, which obviously was going to take quite a few hours. So this was not something that I wanted them to have to go back and do time and time again. So we wanted to make sure that they watched it with purpose. They knew the purpose straight away. So here's what I had them do. And your team can do this, whether it's a movie, whether it's a novel, whether it's a Shakespeare play, whatever it is. So I had them draw up a big two-way table, like a full A4 page, possibly even a double page spread if they've got their exercise book open. And they put the 1 or 2 key themes along the top. Now, if it's the first time that they're watching it or reading it, they may not know what these are, but I really would advise them to get ahead of the game and go look it up. Find an online study guide for whatever the text is that they're studying and find what those key themes or the one key message is. To be honest, there really shouldn't be more than a couple of themes, maybe absolute maximum of 3. And then they also want to have the main 2 or 3 characters down the left-hand side. So they've got themes or messages going across the top, characters down the left-hand side. So now they're going to have a big sheet with a grid with plenty of space to record things as they go. And then as they watch or as they maybe reread the novel, they note down specific evidence. So it could be key events, quotes, specific language devices, literary techniques the author has used, and they put those into the relevant boxes. And what this means is that not only is your teen now having to process that information to decide which box to actually put it in, but also this is now going to be a way for them to logically and visually lay out the information. They're processing it into a different format. They've transformed the information. Plus, double whammy bonus, I like getting multiple benefits from these things. They are now creating a resource that will come in really useful for answering a future essay or some sort of extended response question or to help with revision for an exam. Because the contents of that grid are then going to be all of their pieces of evidence to choose from. And that's why I say to focus on themes and characters, not just noting down a chronological series of events, which is the trap that many students fall into when they have to write about a text. They spend lots of time or a lot of their word count recounting or retelling parts of the storyline. Now, in short response, comprehension style questions, maybe it's in classwork or homework, that are really just testing their knowledge and understanding of the text, this might be what's required, just recounting certain things that happen or who does what. But I can tell you that every essay or extended response analytical style question that I've ever seen is always focused on either themes or characters. So those are the things that I would be having your teen focus on when they are reading or rereading or reviewing any kind of text, a novel, a play, a movie, anything. But what I really want you to take from this is not so much the grid, it's not so much the specifics, but it is that idea of thinking ahead. What are they going to need to do with this? What is this rereading leading to? How are they going to use this? And then they can strategically choose the actions or the activities that are going to tactically feed into that final tangible outcome. And like the example that I just shared, ideally, they might be able to find something where they have multiple benefits along the way. Just don't let your teen review or repeat something just for the sake of it. They just never want to be repeating something that's already happened or doing it twice in the exact same way. It just won't be giving them those additional benefits. Okay, so let's also address that extra reading or wider research one that I mentioned at the start. Students will not be examined on content beyond the curriculum or the syllabus. So there really isn't much benefit at all to be gained from doing this from an academic perspective. Now, like I said earlier, if they want to take things further because it's just something they're super interested in, I am not here trying to kill that passion or that interest. And if you just feel like they would really benefit from having, some wider knowledge or understanding of what's going on, that's totally valid as well. But I have told you the story before of me reading and writing notes on extra case studies for geography in the library back in my A-levels, only to try to shoehorn them into an answer, into the exam, to try to show the marker what a hardworking student I was and that I have this extra knowledge, when instead getting really good at describing or explaining or analysing, comparing existing case studies that I already had learned would have been a much better use of my time and energy. In other words, developing my exam technique, which of course I can reflect on now and know that it really wasn't all that. And the other thing I know now is that I wouldn't have gotten any marks for shoehorning in those examples in the exam either. So instead, if your teen is already at a good or higher level in their subject knowledge, and I just mean that as a general judgment, if they're already pretty good, I would instead have them working on building their exam technique or actively revising the content that they have already covered that's in the syllabus, or using practice to hone their essay skills, like dissecting the question or creating a fast but detailed plan, or making decisions around structuring their points and their body paragraphs. And I do know the reason that a lot of students don't do that is because they're not necessarily trained in those things in the first place. So if your team needs that training, the 10-week Great Transformation Program is there for them. Now, I will caveat all of this about not just doing wider reading with something that another parent asked me in a different question, but it's tied to this, so I'm going to answer it here as well. And that was about widening a student's vocabulary and getting to grips with different genres, more styles of writing. So Jen asked, how do I efficiently and effectively extend his vocab and have him get better at writing in different styles? Another great question. And yes, the usual way I see parents trying to instill this or develop this is by getting their teen to just read more, and ideally reading lots of different types of texts. And that can be a way to do this. But again, let's really maximize it. And so let's get clear on what you really want to achieve. So in Jen's case, giving her son something to look for and take action on. And in this case, it's specifically going to be for different writing styles or writing according to different genres or audiences. And of course, also picking up new words, new vocabulary. So as he's reading, have him consider or ideally jot down things like, okay, is this being written in the first or third person? What's the opening like? What's the first sentence like? What about the conclusion or the final sentence? Are there any patterns that we can see? In other words, what can he take from this reading that he's doing and then use for himself? How can he take this and carry it forwards? So not direct words that he's read that he can carry forwards, but the things that he notices. And this can be tricky, especially if students don't really know what they're looking for. So how can he take some of the elements or the features or the patterns on board for himself? And if he can't pick these out, and it can be a challenge, he's not going to be able to take them on for himself anyway. So sometimes these things can be truly hard to identify, and that is therefore what we need to address first. So some of these things are actually great ways to highlight the real issue underlying everything. And for the vocabulary, we don't just want him reading over or just coming across new words, because that doesn't mean that he can use them for himself or even that he understands them in what he's actually reading. So maybe he could have just a small exercise book where he writes in new words he comes across and then looks them up for definitions or meanings and examples of use. And I know students do that a lot in school, but do we do that if we're asking them to do extra reading outside of school? Now, for sure, this will slow down the reading. And in fact, no longer is it just reading, right? But remember, we don't want students just reading for the sake of reading. What we want is to make it effective. And this is where I think we really need to distinguish between reading for pleasure and reading for a purpose. Because I also know that many students do not particularly love reading. And I know a lot of parents wish that they did. Some students do, and that's great, but some don't. And I will admit that I really got put off reading from about Year 9 upwards in English. Not that I'm criticizing any of the teachers or how I was taught, but I just really didn't enjoy or just couldn't really get into most of the books that we studied. And I will tell you, one of them was Oliver Twist. And that just almost felt like reading a foreign language for a really big, thick, heavy book. I basically felt like I was being forced to read dull and heavy-going books. So I wouldn't enjoy the actual reading. But of course, being a good student, I did it. But having some sort of purpose or structure to the study of the text, having some actions and steps really did help me at the time when we had a particular task to do. And I know it would have helped me going through and reading just because I kind of just wanted to get it done. I wanted to do the task, and it just wasn't something that I particularly enjoyed. And it took me many years to develop an enjoyment of reading just for pleasure again. So having some clear actions or strategies for reading with purpose might also help if you have a teen in a similar situation. So overall, my message here is that yes, doing additional study can be super helpful for your teen in their understanding and when they're trying to remember what they're learning in class or when they're preparing for an assessment or revising for an exam. But we don't want them aimlessly studying, in inverted commas. Just doing activities that feel like they should be productive or where the only tangible outcome is that they just get to feel good for having spent some time on something study related. So whether it's you making some requests or suggestions on them doing some extra study, or if they are looking for some ways to get ahead of the game or extend themselves or just consolidate so that they really feel confident in what they are learning, just don't have them do anything until they've considered why they're doing it. We want to make sure that the direct payoff is clear. And so, to round up, I thought I'd share a few questions that you might like to just use to consider or that your teen can have to ask themselves to figure out what those activities could be or whether an activity they're already doing is as effective as it could be. So first of all, you can ask, what is this actually helping to develop or build? Is it to build or develop their subject knowledge, or is it for the skills in applying that knowledge? And then, how specifically will this help? What is it going to do or produce? So if it's to do with consolidating or building their subject knowledge, how does it relate to the syllabus content? Is what they're doing active or passive? So we want them processing or transforming the information in some way. Is it doing that? How could we make it more active? Or get the same outcome, if it already is active, more efficiently? Could we get the same outcome? Is there a better way to transform that information so it becomes more efficient? So how will this knowledge be used? So is it research for an inquiry? Is it revision for a topic test or for an exam? And maybe even take a step back and ask, is it the subject knowledge that's holding your teen back? Or would they be better off spending their time and energy on developing or building their skills of applying their existing knowledge with things like exam technique or essay strategy or understanding marking criteria and dissecting questions and knowing how to respond to those dissected questions? And then finally, how will you know that the time spent or the activity completed has been useful? What outcome will it result in? For example, if you want them to do wider reading, what do you want them to get out of doing that? And how will you both know that that has been achieved, at least to some extent? So before your teen dives into doing any additional study, they need to know why they are doing whatever they are doing with their time. They need to know specifically how and where it will pay off. Otherwise, it may well be time that's better used on just relaxing or recharging and taking some time out or on whatever else is going on in their busy lives. They just don't want to be studying for the sake of studying. So that's it for today's Q&A. But before I go, if you are a repeat listener to this podcast, I have a favor to ask. Would you take 5 seconds right now to just tap to rate this podcast on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen? You can literally do it right now as you listen to me saying this. And if you are feeling super awesome, you could go ahead and leave a quick review as well. I would really appreciate it, and it helps get this podcast and therefore this information out to more and more parents, which means someone that you will never know somewhere in the world is going to be super grateful to you, and that just kind of creates nice karma. So we have one more Q&A episode left. If you have a question you'd like to pick my brain on, big or small, email support@rocksolidstudy.com, put podcast question in the subject line and shoot it through. And then be sure to join me next week because I have a very special episode with a super special guest who I am so pleased to have share their extensive wisdom with you on a topic that I know is crazy important to so many of you, but is just not in my area of expertise. So I will leave you with that teaser. Have a brilliant week, and I will see you then. Thank Thank you so much for listening. Make sure you head on over to www.rocksolidstudy.com and sign up for my free parent guide. The 3 huge mistakes even smart students make in exams and assignments, and how to fix them immediately. And I'll see you back here next week.